But first I want to talk about the options, which I don't think are options. And preface that by saying that a negotiated solution is necessary. Negotiations are involved in every single one of the options you can envision. Even if you envision the most extreme option, which is a military strike, at some point that involves negotiations. So we shouldn't hold up a negotiated solution as an option in itself. Negotiations are required for any solution. However, I would say that any approach that relies solely on negotiations and inducements, absent pressure or absent some other approach, is not going to work if, in fact, you accept my argument that the Iranian regime is determined in its desire for a nuclear weapon, which it sees as satisfying core national interests. So what are not options? I don't think that Iran is likely to trust or value very highly security guarantees from the United States. It's had a century of bad experiences with Western powers. I don't think it's going to trust one U.S. administration to give security guarantees. Nor do I think that necessarily it would see it as a good thing to be seeking security guarantees from the West. It's not something that a confident country does. At the same time, I think that we would be probably quite loath to trust the regime's own declarations about its nuclear program, given its history of working covertly in places like Natanz and Qom and so forth. What about a grand bargain? To me, a grand bargain would take far too much time to negotiate, given the number of issues that we have to resolve in the context of a grand bargain. And offering one, being seen to offer one, might actually embolden Iran to speed up the pursuit of its nuclear weapons, if it feels that, in fact, we're ready to make concessions. And finally, I think that we have to consider the effect of what we do on the opposition in Iran, given that change in Iran of the type that can only be generated internally is probably the best long-term hope for peace and stability, not only in the region, but between ourselves and the Iranians. I think we also need to put aside the idea that containment, quote-unquote, is an option for resolving this problem. Containment, I think, is what we do if we've failed to resolve the problem. We're already trying to contain Iranian power and influence. And if Iran were to succeed in getting a nuclear weapons capability, all we'd be trying to do is to contain them with that capability as opposed to without it. And it would be much more difficult. Containment is also, I think we need to remember, you can remember this from the experience with the Soviet Union, it's a military option. It's not a non-military or diplomatic option. It involves military deployments, usually of significant scale, and may even involve low-level military activities. Or even higher-level military activities. So it's not an alternative to military action. It is military action. But what do we do, therefore? It's not enough to sort of knock down options. You actually have to not have an option to propose, something I learned when I was in government. Given that sanctions aren't having much effect right now, or the effect they're having simply isn't enough, and Iran's nuclear program, on the other hand, seems to be proceeding apace. You can argue about how quickly and what the time frame is, but in any event, it's making progress. Time is working in the Iranian regime's favor. We have to get time to work in our favor, I think. And there are a couple of encouraging things on this score. Why would time work against the regime? One is simply the domestic pressure it's under politically, which I think is significant. And if you look at the patterns of Iranian history, there are these social undercurrents which we're seeing, which have occurred in the past, and which approve the undoing of regimes that become perceived as corrupt and tyrannical and so forth. That's a bigger topic which I won't engage in fully here. The second is the precarious economic situation. I'm not sure if everyone realizes, but Iranian oil production is actually diminishing, may go down by as much as 20% by 2015. Oil export revenue accounts for 50% of Iran's budget revenue, so this is very significant. If you combine it with what has been the absolute gross economic mismanagement under President Ahmadinejad's government, it's not a rosy picture for Iran economically. So indigenous forces inside Iran will cause the regime to come under greater pressure, absent anything that we can do. So time could work in our favor, but how do we capitalize on these trends? We have to significantly impede and delay Iran's nuclear program. Otherwise, it doesn't make a difference for us. The current sanctions, I think, are a good first step. It's not, as I said, enough to get us over the finish line, but it's a good step, not a first step. It's in a series of steps. We're trying to deny parts, financing, expertise to Iran's nuclear sector and other sectors. That's the right thing to do. I think, though, that rather than standing back now and waiting for the sanctions to work, as some have said, it's important that we continue to apply new sanctions to keep the regime on its back foot and prevent it from adjusting to the sanctions that we're imposing. That can be difficult. That's easier said than done, but I think it's necessary to be creative and to continually apply new pressure. I think part of that has to be trying to prevent Iran from gaining on its oil exports. People have talked about the idea of a quote-unquote commercial blockade, not a naval blockade, but trying to get Iran's customers to buy less from them or to stop buying from them. It's easier said than done, but it focuses on, but the key people involved would be U.S. allies like South Korea, Japan, and most importantly, China, who are Iran's biggest oil customers. We also have to, I think, hamper Iran's efforts to project power in the region. Greater efforts need to be put into interdicting, for example, Iranian weapons. This will frustrate this perimeter defense strategy, which I talked about before, and enhance this feeling of isolation, which we want to put on them. And then finally, I do think that we should increase our support for human rights and democracy in Iran, because I think that we need to be clear with the Iranian people, especially, that we're not going to repeat past mistakes of siding with the regime that's oppressing them against the populace of Iran, and it puts us in better stead for the long term in Iran, and also helps those who are trying to put pressure on the regime as well inside Iran. I've run out of time, but I just want to say very briefly, I think when it comes to military strikes, I do think the military option has to stay on the table, and explicitly so. For one thing, this tells everyone involved, especially the Iranians, just how vital we feel this interest is to the United States. If we say it's unacceptable, if we say it's a vital American interest, then that means that we are contemplating military action. I think that needs to be clear. And paradoxically, I think by making that clear, you make it more likely that you won't have to use military action. Because if some Iranian official, if they're making that cost-benefit analysis and they see that at the end of this process is possible military action, and they reason backwards from that, I think that makes them more likely, rather than less likely, to take whatever deal might be on the table now. So let me stop there, and we'll look forward to hearing from Trita, and then look forward to hearing your questions afterwards. Thanks very much.
Trita? Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, the Middle East Institute. It's a great pleasure being here. I'll try to keep my remarks as brief as possible so we can get to the Q&A, and at that stage start addressing each other's premises, as you mentioned, Michael. I think taking a look at what has happened in the last year, if we're to take a look at what went wrong, why are we not in a position right now in which we can say that progress has been made on the nuclear front, in which we can say that the engagement policy of the Obama administration has yielded at least some of the results that it was looking for. I think we have to recognize that obviously it has been more disappointing than people had expected. But I would have some differences, I think, with Michael when it comes to the broader analysis of why exactly do we have this failure. I think many of the reasons that were mentioned are actually quite true. There are elements in the Iranian government that are very ambivalent about the idea of actually having a rapprochement. They may at times feel forced to sit at the negotiating table, but are they really willing to go all the way? You have other factors as well, particularly the ones that some in the Iranian government are actually benefiting from sanctions and the economic isolation of the country and have been able to enrich themselves tremendously as a result of this.